blood tasted like copper, and regret. That was my last thought before the monitor flatlined in a sterile, lonely hospital room while my husband played house with another woman. I gave him 10 years. I gave him my pride. In return, Hayes told me to be sensible, to make room. But when I opened my eyes, the smell of bleach was gone. I wasn't dead. I was back. And this time, I wasn't going to be sensible at all. Rain lashed against the living room window, a rhythmic, violent sound that I hadn't heard in years. My lungs expanded. Air rushed in, tasting of damp wool, and the bitter, dark roast coffee sitting on the glass table in front of me. I blinked. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the oncology ward were gone. Instead, the soft amber glow of my old living room lamp illuminated the space. My hands, resting in my lap, weren't hooked to IV lines. They were smooth. The skin wasn't paper-thin and bruised purple. I stared at them, my pulse hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. "Nora, are you even listening to me?" The voice hit me like a physical blow. Low, commanded, accustomed to being obeyed without question. I looked up. Hayes sat across from me, in the leather armchair he insisted we buy, despite it clashing with everything else in the room. He wore his service uniform, the fabric crisp, the brass buttons dull in the low light. He smelled of rain, starch, and that faint, sharp tang of gun oil. He looked exactly as he had 5 years before I died. Broad shoulders, a jawline that looked carved from something unyielding, and eyes the color of winter ice. He was leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped. His expression was a familiar mask of strained patience. "I'm telling you this because I respect you," Hayes said, his tone infuriatingly even. "Sienna is pregnant. She's alone. The deployment was complicated. It meant nothing to me, Nora. You know that. But the child is mine. I won't abandon my blood." A visceral wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I remembered this day. God, I remembered it with sickening clarity. October 14th, the day my marriage became a waiting room for a funeral. In my past life, my first life, a phrase that made my brain itch with absurdity. I had cried. I had fallen to my knees. I had screamed until my throat was raw. And then, eventually, under the crushing weight of his logic and my own pathetic dependency, I had agreed. I had let Sienna move into our guest room. I had cooked for her. I had watched my husband touch her swelling belly while I withered away, the stress eating me alive until the cancer finished the job. "I need you to be sensible about this," Hayes continued, mistaking my silence for submission. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering mine. "We have a good life. That doesn't have to change. You're my wife. She'll just be here until we figure things out. I need you to be the bigger person, Nora. Care for her, just for a while." His touch was warm. It made my skin crawl. I looked down at his hand, then back up to his face. The audacity of it was staggering. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was issuing a deployment order. Be sensible. Make room. Swallow your dignity so I don't have to feel guilty. I pulled my hand back slowly. I didn't snatch it away. I just slid it off the table and placed it back in my lap. My fingers were trembling, a faint, high-frequency vibration. Not from heartbreak, from rage. A cold, heavy rage that felt entirely alien and completely right. "Sensible," I repeated. My voice was raspy, dry as dust. Hayes sighed, sitting back in his chair. The leather creaked. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You know the optics of a divorce. My command wouldn't look favorably on it. And frankly, Neither would your family. We can manage this. Together. He was so confident, so profoundly arrogant in his belief that I was a permanent fixture in his life, like the oak dining table or the Persian rug. Where is she now? I asked. Hayes blinked, clearly thrown by the logistical question. He was expecting tears. He had his speech ready for tears. She's at a hotel downtown. The Wellington. I told her I'd come get her this evening once you and I talked. I see. My mind was a chaotic mess of static, but beneath it, a sharp, singular instinct was taking over. Get out! The house felt suddenly suffocating. The air was too thick. The walls were closing in, pressing the smell of his aftershave and the memory of my own death into my pores. I have to go to the base to sign some paperwork, Hayes said, standing up. He adjusted his collar, looking down at me with a microscopic softening in his eyes. Pity. He pitied me. I'll be back in 3 hours. We'll go get her together. It'll show a united front. He walked over, bending down to press a kiss to the top of my head. I held my breath, closing my eyes until I heard his boots echo down the hallway. The heavy oak front door opened and clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place. I sat alone in the quiet house for exactly 3 minutes. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked. Tick, 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 counting down the seconds of the life I was about to detonate. Then I stood up. My knees popped. My head swam. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the mug of cold coffee, and poured it down the sink. Packing 10 years of a life into a manageable space is a violent process. I didn't go to the attic for the heavy, hard-shell suitcases we used for our honeymoon. I went to the guest room closet, the room Hayes intended to give to his pregnant mistress, and pulled out 2 large, black canvas duffel bags. They were utilitarian, ugly, perfect. The bedroom I shared with Hayes smelled of his cedarwood cologne and my lavender lotion. It was a perfectly curated magazine spread of domestic bliss. I walked to my dresser and pulled the drawers open, the wood scraping loudly in the quiet house. I didn't pack the silk nightgowns. I didn't pack the expensive, structured dresses I wore to the battalion holiday parties, the ones that made me look like the perfect, supportive officer's wife. I grabbed denim, sweaters, t-shirts, underwear, practical things, things that wouldn't wrinkle when crammed into a bag. Every item I touched felt heavy, laden with a sickening sunk cost fallacy. 10 years. I had spent 10 years making sure his boots were polished, his meals were hot, his social calendar was flawless. I had hollowed myself out to build a home for a man who looked at me and saw a convenience. A wave of dizziness hit me. I gripped the edge of the mahogany dresser, my knuckles turning white. My stomach churned, a sour burn rising in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, half expecting to open them and find myself back in the hospital bed, choking on my own fluids. Breathe, I told myself. You are breathing. You are alive. I opened my eyes. The brass handles of the dresser gleamed. I moved to the bathroom. Toothbrush, deodorant, tampons, a bottle of Advil, the mundane necessities of outrunning a disaster. I caught my reflection in the mirror over the double vanity. I looked terrifying, pale, with dark bags under my eyes and a frantic, feral tightness around my mouth. I didn't look like the woman Hayes had just left in the living room. I looked like a cornered animal. Good. Back in the bedroom, I walked to my jewelry box. I opened it, the tiny musical mechanism playing a tinny, warped version of Fur-Elise. Inside lay the diamond necklace he bought me after his first deployment, the pearl earrings from our 5th anniversary. I didn't touch them. They felt like bribes, paid in retrospect. I looked down at my left hand. The platinum band and the 2-carat solitaire diamond felt suddenly like handcuffs. Taking a ring off after 10 years isn't smooth. The skin underneath was pale, compressed, indented. The metal caught on my knuckle. I had to tug, twisting the cold platinum, rubbing the skin raw until it finally popped over the joint. I held the rings in the palm of my hand. They were heavy. They caught the gray afternoon light filtering through the blinds. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and back into the living room. I placed the rings exactly in the center of the glass coffee table, right next to the coaster where his coffee mug had been. Next was the money. I wasn't an idiot. I went to the home office, booted up the desktop computer, and logged into our joint accounts. There was $40,000 in savings. In my first life, I had never touched it. I had let him dictate the finances. Not today. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicking loud and sharp. I initiated a transfer of $20,000, exactly half, into a private account I had opened years ago and barely used. It would take 24 hours to clear, but it was in motion. Then, I pulled the folder of important documents from the filing cabinet. Birth certificate, social security card, passport. I shoved them into my purse. I slung the 2 duffel bags over my shoulders. The weight dug into my collarbones. I stood in the foyer, looking back at the house. There was no cinematic feeling of triumph. There was no soaring background music. My heart was racing. My armpits were damp with nervous sweat, and I wanted to throw up. I was terrified. The house was quiet, safe, familiar. Outside was a void, but I knew what staying meant. I had the scars of a death I hadn't yet lived to prove it. I turned the doorknob. The brass was cold. I stepped out onto the porch, the rain instantly hitting my face, cold and shocking. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. It locked with a heavy final click. I walked to my sedan, threw the bags into the trunk, and climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing. I started the engine, the heater roaring to life, smelling vaguely of dust and gasoline. I didn't look back at the house as I pulled out of the driveway. I kept my eyes on the wet, black asphalt unspooling in front of me. The rain hadn't stopped. It beat a relentless tattoo against the windshield, the wipers squeaking as they fought a losing battle against the downpour. I drove for 2 hours, heading north, away from the military base, away from the city, away from the life that had suffocated me. I didn't have a destination. I just drove until the fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank, and my hands began to cramp from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I pulled off the interstate at an exit that boasted nothing but a gas station and a faded billboard for a motel called the Starlight. The Starlight was anything but stellar. It was a single-story, L-shaped building with peeling mustard paint and a neon sign that buzzed loudly, the R flickering erratically. It was exactly the kind of place where people went to disappear. I parked under the overhang of the small office. The air smelled of wet asphalt and stale cigarette smoke. Inside, a bored teenager behind bulletproof glass barely looked up from his phone as I paid cash for 3 nights. He slid a brass key with a heavy plastic tag through the slot. Room 114. The room smelled of bleach, old dust, and cheap pine cleaner. The carpet was a dark, ambiguous brown that hid a multitude of sins. The bedspread was a stiff, floral polyester. I dropped my bags on the floor. They landed with a heavy, dead thud. I sat on the edge of the mattress. It creaked in protest, sagging in the middle. The silence in the room was absolute. broken only by the hum of the mini fridge in the corner. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen was cracked in the corner. It was 4:15 p.m. Hayes would have been home for 15 minutes. As if sensing my thoughts, the phone vibrated in my palm. The screen lit up. Hayes. My thumb hovered over the red decline button. In my chest, a phantom pressure bloomed. The ingrained instinct to answer, to placate, to apologize for causing a disturbance. I watched the screen flash. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The call went to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through. "Where are you?" "Sienna is waiting." I let out a harsh, barking laugh that scraped my dry throat. He hadn't noticed the rings yet, or the bags. He just noticed that his schedule was being inconvenienced. 5 minutes passed. The phone rang again. This time, I could almost feel the heat radiating from the device. I declined it. Immediately, the texts started pouring in. "Nora, pick up the phone. Where are your bags? This isn't funny. Are you out of your goddamn mind? We talked about this. You are being irrational. Answer me." Irrational. The word tasted sour. He wanted me to house his pregnant mistress and smile for the neighbors, but I was the irrational one for packing a bag. I tossed the phone onto the cheap Formica nightstand. It buzzed and vibrated, dancing across the wood-grain surface like an angry insect. Let him panic. Let his perfectly ordered world fracture. I stood up and walked to the tiny bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered on, casting a sickly green pallor over my face. I turned on the tap, splashing freezing water onto my cheeks, trying to shock the last remnants of the obedient wife out of my system. When I went back into the room, the phone had stopped buzzing. A voicemail notification sat on the screen. I pressed play, putting it on speaker. "Nora." Hayes's voice filled the dingy motel room. He didn't sound panicked. He sounded furious. The tight, controlled fury of a man who was used to absolute authority. "I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling. I found the rings. If you think running away is going to change the reality of this situation, you are severely mistaken. You have until tomorrow morning to bring yourself home, or I am locking the accounts and calling your parents. Stop acting like a child and come back. We have a responsibility here." He had slept with another woman, got her pregnant, and somehow it was our responsibility. The voicemail ended. The silence rushed back in, heavier this time. I didn't cry. I thought I would. I thought the grief of losing a decade of my life would crush me. But instead, I felt a strange, hollow lightness. The kind of lightness you feel after a fever finally breaks. I was shaking, my muscles exhausted, my stomach cramping with hunger and stress. The road ahead was going to be brutal. He would freeze my cards if the transfer didn't clear in time. He would turn our friends against me. He would paint me as the hysterical, barren wife who abandoned him. But as I sat on that cheap, sagging motel bed, listening to the rain beat against the thin glass of the window, I took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like his cologne or my impending death. It smelled like bleach and cheap pine. It smelled like survival. I picked up the phone, went to his contact, and pressed block. Morning came, not with sunlight, but with the harsh, vibrating hum of the motel's ice machine through the thin drywall. I woke up shivering. The polyester bedspread had slipped off during the night, leaving me curled in a tight, defensive ball on the sagging mattress. My neck ached. My mouth tasted like stale air and old copper. For a split second, the disorientation was absolute. I waited for the beep of the heart monitor. I braced for the sharp, stinging plunge of the IV needle into the bruised crook of my arm. Instead, a semi-truck roared past on the interstate outside, rattling the single-pane window. I sat up, gasping, my hands flying to my chest. Flat, solid, no central line port buried beneath the skin. I dragged my hands down my ribs, feeling the steady, strong beat of my heart. The relief didn't feel like a warm hug. It felt like a bucket of ice water down my spine. I was alive. I was alone, in a room that smelled of damp carpet. Panic, sharp and practical, instantly replaced the lingering ghosts of the hospital ward. The money. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet flinching against the gritty texture of the floor. I pulled my laptop from the canvas duffel bag and shoved it onto the small, scratched desk. The motel's open Wi-Fi network took 2 agonizing minutes to connect. The little loading circle spinning and spinning, while my stomach tied itself into rigid knots. I logged into my bank portal. My breath hitched in my throat. Current balance, $40,012. The transfer hadn't cleared. It was still pending. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It was Friday morning. If Hayes had gone to the bank the moment it opened, he could freeze the joint accounts. He could dispute the transfer. He had the military rank, the authoritative voice, the innate ability to make anyone behind a desk bend to his will. I could already hear him explaining to a sympathetic teller that his wife was having a mental health crisis. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. My stomach gave a loud, hollow growl, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since a piece of toast yesterday morning. I needed cash, immediately. I threw on the clothes I'd worn yesterday. The denim felt stiff, the sweater smelled faintly of the rain from my driveway, and grabbed my purse. I left the laptop running on the desk and walked out into the crisp, biting morning air. There was a generic ATM at the gas station next door. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a sickly yellow hue over the aisles of beef jerky and energy drinks. I slid my debit card into the machine. It asked for my PIN. My fingers trembled as I punched in the 4 digits. Hayes's birth year. God, I hated myself for that. Withdrawal amount. I hit Other and typed in $800, the daily limit. The machine thought about it. It whirred. It clicked. Every second stretched into a suffocating eternity. I expected the screen to flash red. Declined. Account frozen. Please contact your branch. Instead, the mechanical gears ground loudly, and a stack of crisp $20 bills spat out of the slot. I snatched them, my hands shaking so violently I dropped one on the sticky linoleum floor. I scooped it up, shoved the wad into my pocket, and practically ran back to the motel room. It wasn't $20,000, but it was enough to survive the week. Back in the room, I refreshed the banking tab. Still pending. There was nothing more I could do but wait. The helplessness was maddening. In my first life, I had specialized in helplessness. I had perfected the art of waiting for Hayes to make a decision, waiting for the doctors to deliver bad news, waiting for my own body to fail. I wasn't going to sit in this room and wait. I drove to a massive, warehouse-style store 2 towns over. The sheer scale of the place, the glaring white lights, the endless aisles of bulk toilet paper and giant televisions. It was sensory overload. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the other shoppers pushing their oversized carts. I bought a prepaid burner phone wrapped in thick, tamper-proof plastic. I bought a cheap pack of men's undershirts, a box of instant oatmeal, plastic spoons, and a massive jug of filtered water. It was survival stripped down to its ugliest, most basic components. When I returned to the car, the sky had turned a bruising shade of purple, threatening more rain. I ripped the plastic off the burner phone with my teeth, scraping my gums in the process. I powered it on, registering it to a fake name. Jane Smith. How original. I sat in the driver's seat, listening to the rain begin to drum against the roof, and pulled my real phone from the glove compartment where I had stashed it. I powered it on just to check the collateral damage. 84 missed calls. A string of text messages that shifted from furious to patronizing to thinly veiled threats. Hayes, Sienna had a panic attack last night. This is not good for the baby. Come home. Hayes, your mother called. I told her you were feeling unwell. You're embarrassing us both. Hayes, I went to the bank. My thumb froze over the screen. I stared at that last message. He went to the bank. I threw the phone back into the glove box, slamming it shut, and scrambled for my laptop sitting on the passenger seat. I connected to my phone's hotspot, my fingers slipping on the keys. I logged into the bank portal again. Joint account balance, $20,012. Account status, frozen. I clicked over to my private secondary account, the one I had opened years ago to save up for an anniversary trip to Italy that we never took because Hayes got a promotion and couldn't take the leave. Available balance, $20,050. I let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was a jagged, ugly noise that filled the small space of the car. The transfer had cleared. He had frozen the joint account, but he was hours too late to stop the hemorrhage. I leaned my forehead against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, the adrenaline crashing out of my system, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. I had my money. I had my car. I had my life. Now, I just had to figure out how to live it. 3 weeks later, the Washington rain traded itself for the dry, biting wind of southern Idaho. I didn't choose the town for its charm. I chose it because it looked like a place people drove through without stopping. The apartment I rented was above a laundromat on the edge of the historic district. It was a single room with a hot plate, a miniature fridge, and a bathroom where the shower head hit me squarely in the chest. The air in the apartment constantly smelled of industrial laundry detergent and hot, damp lint. It seeped into my clothes, my hair, even the pores of my skin. But the rent was cheap, and the landlord, a tired man with a severe underbite, didn't ask for a credit check when I handed him 3 months' cash up front. To him, I was Nora. Just Nora. No last name required. I needed a routine. If I didn't keep moving, the silence of the tiny apartment threatened to swallow me whole. I found a job waiting tables at a diner on the highway, off-ramp. It wasn't the kind of place that served avocado toast. It was the kind of place that served chicken fried steak at 6 in the morning to long-haul truckers and local mechanics. My first week was physical agony. My feet, accustomed to sensible flats and carpeted officers' club floors, blistered and bled. The heavy ceramic plates burned my forearms. My lower back screamed at the end of every 8-hour shift. But I loved it. I loved the brutal, mindless physical labor. I loved the smell of burning grease and bitter, black coffee. I loved that the customers didn't care who I was, as long as their mugs were full. For 10 years, my worth had been tied to how well I reflected upon my husband. Here, my worth was tied to how fast I could carry 3 plates of eggs and hash browns. It was a transaction I could understand. One Tuesday afternoon, the diner was dead. The lunch rush had cleared out, leaving behind a sticky film on the tables and a faint haze of fry oil in the air. I was wiping down a booth in the back corner, my hands submerged in a bucket of hot water and cheap, lemon-scented sanitizer. A bell jingled above the door. An older man walked in, wearing a heavy winter coat. As he passed me on his way to the counter, he coughed. It was a deep, rattling, wet cough. The sound hit my ear, and reality fractured. Suddenly, I wasn't in the diner. The smell of the lemon sanitizer warped, turning sharp and sterile, morphing into hospital-grade bleach. The red vinyl of the booth faded into the sterile white sheets of an adjustable bed. The hum of the diner's refrigerator became the rhythmic, terrifying pulse of an IV pump. Her white blood cell count is plummeting. A phantom voice echoed in my head. I dropped the rag. It hit the floor with a wet slap. My vision tunneled. I couldn't breathe. My lungs forgot how to expand. The phantom pain of a body eating itself alive flared in my bones. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning stark white, my nails digging into the cheap laminate. "Hey, Nora, you good?" The voice was rough, breaking through the static in my brain. I blinked, gasping for air. The diner rushed back into focus. Patty, the manager, was standing behind the counter, a pot of decaf in her hand, eyeing me with a mixture of annoyance and concern. "I'm fine," I choked out. My voice sounded thin, reedy. I swallowed hard, the muscles in my throat tight. Just dizzy for a second. Stood up too fast. Patty snorted, returning to pouring the coffee. "Eat a biscuit. You look like a ghost." I bent down, my knees shaking, and picked up the wet rag. The water in the bucket was turning gray. I walked to the employee bathroom, locked the flimsy door behind me, and sank onto the closed toilet seat. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until bursts of color exploded in the darkness. I was physically healthy. I had checked. In my second week here, I had gone to a free clinic and demanded a full blood panel. I paid, out of pocket. The doctor had looked at me like I was insane, but she ran the tests. They came back perfectly normal. The cancer that had ravaged me, that had turned my bones to glass and my skin to parchment, didn't exist in this timeline. But my mind didn't know that. My brain had lived through the agony. It had recorded the trauma of slowly dying while the man I loved planned a nursery for his bastard child down the hall. I looked at my hands, resting in my lap. The skin was rough now. Calluses were forming on the pads of my fingers from the hot plates. A fresh burn marked my left wrist from the toaster oven. They were not the soft, manicured hands of an officer's wife. They were the hands of a woman fighting to stay above water. Surviving the end of my life had been a singular event. Unplugging from haze was a singular event. But living, actually continuing to put one foot in front of the other, carrying the rotting memories of a future that hadn't happened yet, that was a grinding, daily war, and I wasn't sure I knew how to win it. It was a Sunday evening, the one day the diner closed early. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, a bowl of cheap ramen resting on my crossed legs. The TV was on, volume low, playing some mindless infomercial that bathed the small room in a flickering blue light. The burner phone, resting on the laminate counter, buzzed. It was a jarring sound. No one had this number except my sister, Chloe. I had emailed her my new number from a secure library computer 2 weeks ago, with strict, explicit instructions not to share it with anyone, not our parents, and absolutely, under no circumstances, Hayes. I set the bowl down, a knot tightening just beneath my ribs. I walked over and picked up the small black plastic device. The screen read, "Incoming call, Chloe." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and pressed the green button. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the faint sound of static, and then a heavy, familiar sigh. Not Chloe's sigh. "Nora, what on earth are you doing to us?" The blood drained from my face, rushing down to my toes in a freezing swoop. It was my mother, Brenda. My grip on the phone tightened until the cheap plastic creaked. "Where is Chloe?" I demanded, my voice instantly hardening. "Your sister left her phone on the kitchen counter," my mother said. Her tone was a masterclass in weaponized disappointment. Soft, wounded, heavy with judgment. "She shouldn't have hidden this from me. We have been out of our minds with worry. The police wouldn't even let us file a missing persons report because Hayes told them you left voluntarily." "I did leave voluntarily," I said, staring at the peeling wallpaper above the hot plate. "I'm safe. I'm fine." "Fine?" she scoffed, the sound sharp and biting. "You steal half of your husband's savings, abandon your home, turn off your phone, and you call that fine? Nora, you are acting like a hysterical child. You need to come home." "Did Hayes call you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Of course he called us," she snapped, dropping the wounded mother act. "He is terrified. He's humiliated. The battalion commander's wife was asking about you at the gala last night. He had to invent some story about a family emergency." "A family emergency," I repeated, the absurdity of it bubbling up my throat like battery acid. Did he mention the pregnant woman he moved into his guest room? Did he bring her to the gala? Silence. On the line. A long, heavy silence. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was the tone she used when I was a teenager and had worn a dress she deemed unflattering. "Hayes explained the situation to your father and me." "Oh, he explained it." I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a trapped bird slamming against a cage. "And what exactly did he explain, Mom?" "He made a mistake, Nora," she said, her words measured, defensive. "A terrible, stupid mistake while he was deployed. He admits that. But he is a good man. He provides for you. He gives you a beautiful home, a respected position in the community. You don't throw away a 10-year marriage because a man has a moment of weakness. You stay. You fix it. You don't embarrass him like this." The floor beneath my feet felt suddenly unsteady. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against the cool, painted drywall. In my past life, when the cancer had first been diagnosed, my mother had told me to be strong for Hayes. "It's hard on a man to see his wife sick," she had said, sitting beside my hospital bed, reading a magazine. "Make sure you're still making an effort for him." They didn't love me. They loved the idea of me. They loved the prestige of having a son-in-law with brass on his collar. I was just the necessary glue, holding that relationship together. "He wants me to raise his mistress's child, Mom," I said. My voice wasn't yelling. It was quiet, dead. "It's an unorthodox arrangement, yes," she countered quickly, refusing to cede ground. "But he is taking responsibility for his actions. That shows character. You could learn to love the child. It could be good for you, Nora. You know, since you've had trouble in that department." The cruelty of the statement was so casual, so profoundly, deeply ingrained in her worldview, that it physically stole my breath. Trouble in that department. The 2 miscarriages that had ripped my soul to shreds, reduced to a bargaining chip to justify my husband's infidelity. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit me. The smell of the ramen sitting on the floor turned my stomach. "Nora, are you listening to me?" Her voice buzzed through the cheap speaker. Hayes says, if you come back by Friday, he won't involve the lawyers. He'll forgive the money you took. We can just put this ugly business behind us. I'll even come stay with you for a few weeks to help smooth things over with the girl. I opened my eyes. The blue light from the television danced across the darkened room. Tell Chloe to change her passcode, I said, my voice eerily calm. Nora, don't you dare hang. I pressed the red button. The screen went black. The silence of the apartment rushed back in, deafening and absolute. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream. I walked methodically to the bathroom, lifted the lid of the toilet, and threw up. I retched until my stomach was entirely empty, until nothing came up but bitter, yellow bile. My throat burned. My eyes streamed. I collapsed backward, my spine hitting the edge of the cheap, fiberglass bathtub, the cold seeping through my thin t-shirt. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, shaking uncontrollably. It was gone, all of it. The illusion of my marriage, the illusion of my family's unconditional love. I had taken a match to the rotting foundation of my life, and now I was sitting in the ashes. Hayes wasn't just a bad husband. He was a master manipulator who had successfully isolated me from the very people who should have protected me. He had bought their loyalty with his rank and his stability. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eye sockets until it hurt. I was utterly, completely alone. If I died tomorrow, if a car hit me, or if the phantom cancer somehow materialized in my blood, no one would come to claim my body. Hayes would only want the money back. My mother would only mourn the embarrassment. The thought was terrifying. It was a dark, yawning abyss right at my feet. But as I sat there on the cold bathroom floor, listening to the muffled tumbling of the washing machines down below, the terror began to shift. The shaking slowly subsided. The burning in my throat dulled. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. I was alone. I had no safety net. I had no family to fall back on, which meant I had absolutely no one left to please, no one left to be sensible for. I pushed myself off the floor, walked to the sink, and rinsed my mouth. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair pulled back in a messy, unwashed knot. I looked haggard. I looked tough. I walked back into the living room, picked up the burner phone, and navigated to the settings. I found the option for a factory reset. I didn't hesitate. I pressed confirm. The screen flashed, the little Android icon appearing as it wiped the memory clean, wiping away Chloe, wiping away my mother, severing the very last thread connecting me to the life I left behind. Tomorrow, I would ask Patty for double shifts. I would save enough money to buy a reliable truck. I would move again, maybe further east, into the mountains. Hayes wanted a war. He thought he could starve me out, guilt me into submission, break me down until I crawled back to his pristine, suffocating house. He didn't realize he was fighting a ghost, and ghosts don't know how to surrender. Winter hit Idaho not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a brutal, howling wind that turned the air to glass. I traded the thin denim jacket I had packed for a men's insulated work coat I found at a thrift store down the block. It smelled of stale tobacco and old cedar, but it kept the biting frost from seeping into my bones. For 2 months, my life was a meticulously controlled orbit. The diner, the apartment, the bank. I worked 6 days a week. My hands were perpetually stained with grease and cracked from the industrial dish soap. I kept my head down. I smiled at the truckers, refilled their heavy ceramic mugs with scalding coffee, and pocketed their crumpled $1 tips. Every Friday, I took my cash wages and deposited them into a rusted Maxwell House coffee can I kept shoved in the very back of the cabinet above the hot plate. By December, the can held $3,000. It was enough. I bought a 2006 Ford pickup from a mechanic named Boyd, who operated out of a gravel lot on the edge of town. The truck was a violently ugly shade of maroon, the paint oxidized and peeling like sunburned skin. The heater sounded like a dying asthmatic, but the engine block was solid, and the tires had deep, aggressive tread. Signing the title was the first time I had to use my real name in 9 weeks. My pen hovered over the cheap, yellowed paper of the DMV transfer slip. Nora. The letters looked foreign. I scribbled the signature quickly, a messy, illegible scrawl, handed Boyd the thick wad of 20s, and drove away. The steering wheel was slick with years of accumulated grime, but as I merged onto the highway, the heavy, vibrating hum of the V8 engine beneath my boots felt like a shield. I should have known it would be the title transfer that triggered the tripwire. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the diner's large, condensation-streaked windows was the color of a bruised plum. The lunch rush had thinned out. I was behind the counter, cutting a cherry pie into slightly uneven eighths, the sticky red filling clinging to the knife blade. The bell above the glass door chimed, a sharp, bright sound. I didn't look up immediately. "Take any seat you like," I called out, wiping the knife on a damp rag. "Coffee will be right with you. I'm not looking for food." The voice wasn't a trucker's drawl. It was sharp, clipped, and deeply out of place amidst the smell of fry oil and burnt sugar. I froze. The rag in my hand suddenly felt 100 pounds heavy. I looked up, peering through the small gap between the pie display and the espresso machine. He was standing by the register. He wore a dark wool peacoat, meticulously lint-rolled, and dark denim. His boots weren't work boots. They were expensive, polished leather. He had a tight, military haircut and eyes that swept the room with clinical, calculating efficiency. He wasn't Hayes, but he belonged to Hayes's world, a private investigator, or worse, one of the junior officers Hayes had bullied into doing his dirty work off the books. Patty emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her stained apron. "Can I help you, buddy? Kitchen closes in an hour." The man reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, glossy rectangle. A photograph. He slid it across the laminated counter toward Patty. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, his voice dropping into that authoritative, polite register cops use when they're fishing. "She goes by Nora, about 5'6", brown hair. She's been reported missing by her family. We have reason to believe she might be in this area." My lungs seized. The air in the diner vanished. I pressed my back against the metal side of the industrial refrigerator, sliding down until I was crouching on the sticky, grease-stained tiles. My heart was slamming against my ribs with a violence that made my vision blur. Missing by her family. They were playing the victim card. Hayes had officially spun the narrative. He wasn't a cheating husband. He was a frantic, grieving man, searching for his mentally unstable wife. I strained to hear over the hum of the refrigerator. Patty looked at the photo. The silence stretched. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the kitchen door. Patty was tough. She was a chain-smoking widow who took no nonsense from anyone, but she was also a citizen. If she thought I was in danger, or if she thought she was harboring a fugitive, she would talk. "Missing, huh?" Patty's voice finally rasped. "Yes, ma'am. Her husband is deeply concerned. She left without her medication. Medication. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted to elicit sympathy, I almost gagged. "Well," Patty said, tapping a blunt, acrylic fingernail against the counter. "Can't say I've seen her. We get a lot of drifters off the interstate. Girls looking for a hot meal and a bus ticket. She might have passed through, but she ain't working here." A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. My forehead dropped against my knees. "Are you certain?" The man's voice hardened. "Just a fraction. A vehicle registered in her name pinged a plate scanner on Highway 32 days ago." "I told you!" Patty snapped, her tone instantly defensive. She hated cops, and she hated suits even more. "I don't know her. Now, you gonna order a slice of pie? Or are you gonna block my register?" The man sighed, a sharp intake of breath. I heard the scrape of the photograph being pulled back across the laminate. "If you see her, please call this number. Her family just wants her home." The bell above the door chimed again. The heavy thud of the door closing shook the glass. I stayed crouched on the floor for 3 full minutes. The grease on the tiles soaked through the knees of my jeans. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaking so badly I had to grip the metal counter to stay upright. Patty was standing by the register, watching the street through the window. She didn't turn around. "He's parked across the street," she said quietly. "Black SUV. Windows are tinted." I swallowed the lump of pure terror in my throat. "Patty, Save it," she interrupted, turning to face me. Her eyes were hard, but not unkind. "I don't care what you did. You don't look crazy to me. You look like a girl running from a bad bet. But that guy ain't gonna just leave. He's gonna sit there until my shift ends, and then he's gonna follow me, or he's gonna follow the closer." She walked over to the cash register, popped the drawer, and pulled out an envelope. She walked back and shoved it into my chest. "This is your week's pay, plus your cut of the tips." She looked at my grease-stained coat. "You parked out back?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Take the alley. Don't turn your headlights on until you hit the county road." "Go." I looked at the envelope in my hand, then at the harsh, lined face of the woman who had asked no questions and given me a lifeline. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me," Patty said, turning back to the pie I had abandoned. "Just drive fast." The alley behind the diner was a narrow corridor of brick and frozen mud. I slipped out the heavy steel back door, the frigid air hitting my lungs like crushed ice. My maroon truck was parked between a dumpster and a stack of wooden pallets. I didn't run. Running attracts attention. I power walked, my keys already woven between my knuckles, a defensive habit I had picked up living above the laundromat. I unlocked the heavy door, climbed in, and shoved the key into the ignition. I didn't start the engine immediately. I sat in the freezing cab, the vinyl seat hard as rock beneath me, and calculated, if the P.I. was here, Hayes wasn't far behind. The plate scanner meant my truck was burned. My apartment was a 2-mile drive. I needed my duffel bags. I needed the cash hidden in the mattress. I twisted the key. The V8 roared to life, a loud, obnoxious rumble that echoed off the brick walls. I threw it in gear and crept down the alley in total darkness, my foot hovering over the brake. I didn't switch the headlights on until I was 3 blocks away, merging onto a dark residential street. I took a convoluted route back to the apartment, checking the rearview mirror every 10 seconds. Nothing but empty, snow-dusted roads. I parked the truck 3 blocks down from the laundromat, under the shadow of a dead oak tree. I walked the rest of the way, keeping close to the sides of the buildings, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. The neon sign of the laundromat buzzed, casting a flickering, sickly blue light onto the pavement. The entrance to my stairs was a heavy, unmarked door in the alleyway. I turned the corner into the alley and stopped. A shadow detached itself from the brick wall next to my door. The blue neon light caught the sharp angle of a jaw, the broad, rigid line of shoulders beneath a dark, expensive overcoat. Hayes. He didn't look like a man destroyed by grief. He didn't look frantic. He looked exactly as he always did. Furious, immaculate, and entirely in control. He held a cigarette between his fingers, the red cherry glowing in the dark. He hated smoking. He only did it when his anxiety required an anchor. A maroon Ford, Hayes said. His voice was quiet, bouncing off the brick walls. I had to pay a mechanic named Boyd $200 to confirm he sold a piece of junk to a woman matching your description. My blood went cold. Then it boiled. The sheer arrogance of it. The entitlement. I didn't back away. I didn't flinch. I stood 5 feet from him, the frozen gravel crunching softly beneath my boots. "You're trespassing," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a dead, flat calm. Hayes let out a short, humorless laugh. He dropped the cigarette on the ground and crushed it slowly beneath the heel of his polished boot. "Trespassing. Right. Are you going to call the police, Nora? Please do. I'd love to explain to them how my wife stole $20,000 and disappeared." "Half," I corrected, my tone conversational. I took exactly half of what was in the joint account. Legally, I'm entitled to all of it. You're lucky I have a sense of fairness. He took a step toward me. The smell of his cedarwood cologne cut through the stench of the alley's dumpsters. My stomach rolled, a phantom wave of nausea hitting me. "This game is over," Hayes said, dropping the conversational act. His voice turned into a command, the voice he used on junior enlisted men. "You've had your tantrum. You made your point. You embarrassed me in front of the entire command. Now, you are going to walk upstairs, pack your bags, and get in the SUV. We have a flight at 6 a.m. I looked at him, really looked at him. For 10 years, this man had been the center of my universe. I had measured my worth by his moods. I had planned my life around his deployments. I had literally, in another life, died while trying to make his life easier. He looked small. "Sienna isn't doing well," he continued, reading my silence as hesitation. "The stress of you leaving, it caused complications. She's on bed rest. I need you home, Nora. The house is a mess. I need you to handle this." He wasn't here because he loved me. He wasn't here because he missed his wife. He was here because the logistics of his infidelity had become inconvenient. He needed his maid back. He needed the quiet, compliant buffer between him and the messy reality of the pregnant woman he had ruined his marriage for. A dark, genuine laugh clawed its way out of my throat. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Hayes frowned, his jaw tightening. "Something funny?" "You are spectacular," I breathed, shaking my head. "You genuinely believe I'm going to walk back into that house and scrub the floors for the woman you're sleeping with?" "She's carrying my child," he snapped, taking another step forward, invading my space. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around my bicep. His grip was bruising, a physical manifestation of his authority. "You are my wife. You took a vow." I didn't try to pull away. I didn't struggle. I reached into the deep pocket of my work coat. My fingers wrapped around the cold, textured plastic of the heavy-duty box cutter I used to open frozen fry shipments at the diner. I pushed the metal slide up with my thumb. With a sharp click, an inch of razor-sharp steel locked into place. I brought my hand up, resting the flat side of the blade against the pulse point of his wrist, right where his hand gripped my arm. Hayes froze. His eyes darted down to the blade, then back up to my face. The shock in his eyes was almost comical. "Let go of me," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a 10-ton truck. "Before I ruin your uniform." "Are you insane?" he hissed, his grip loosening slightly, though he didn't drop his hand. "You're going to stab me? Over this?" "In a heartbeat," I replied, staring directly into his pale eyes. "You think you know me, Hayes. You think I'm the woman who cried when you forgot our anniversary. I'm not. That woman is dead. If you don't take your hand off me right now, I will drag this blade across your radial artery, and I will watch you bleed out in this alley." He searched my eyes for the lie. He searched for the bluff. He didn't find one, because it wasn't a bluff. The feral survivalist instinct that had kept me alive for the last 2 months was humming in my veins. Slowly, deliberately, Hayes uncurled his fingers. He took a half step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture, though his face was twisted in disgust. "You've lost your mind," he breathed. "No," I said, sliding the box cutter back into my pocket, keeping my hand wrapped tightly around the handle. "I found it." The adrenaline was a live wire sparking in my brain, but outwardly, my movements were slow and deliberate. "You want to talk legalities, Hayes?" I asked, unzipping the front of my coat. I reached into the inner pocket and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. I had printed the documents at the public library 3 weeks ago. I had been carrying them every single day, waiting for the inevitable. I tossed the envelope. It hit his chest and fell into the dirty snow at his feet. "What is this?" he asked, looking down at it as if it were a bomb. "That is a petition for dissolution of marriage," I said. "I've already signed my section. It outlines a complete severance. I keep the $20,000. You keep the house, your pension, and your pregnant mistress. No alimony, no contest." Hayes scoffed, refusing to bend down and pick it up. "I'm not signing that. I told you. I'm not doing a divorce. The command will be absolutely thrilled to read the 50-page dossier I have sitting in an encrypted email, scheduled to send to the battalion commander, the brigade commander, and the inspector general's office." I interrupted smoothly. His mouth clicked shut. "Adultery is a violation of Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice," I recited, the legal jargon tasting like sweet victory on my tongue, "especially when it is prejudicial to good order and discipline, like, say, knocking up a civilian, moving her into base housing under false pretenses, and driving your legal wife to abandon the state. A general court-martial would end your career. You wouldn't just lose your rank, Hayes. You'd lose your pension. You'd lose your clearance. You'd be bagging groceries by next Christmas." The silence in the alley was absolute. The neon sign buzzed. A car drove past on the main road, throwing a fleeting wash of headlights over us. I watched the realization hit him. I watched the arrogant, immovable foundation of his ego crack and splinter. He had thought he was hunting a frightened rabbit. He had walked into a minefield. "You wouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a plea, dressed up as a challenge. "Try me," I countered softly. "If those papers aren't signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk in Washington by Friday at 5 p.m., the email sends. My lawyer, who I retained with the 20 grand, by the way, has the override codes. If I don't check in, it sends. If you try to track me again, it sends. If your PI comes within 50 feet of me, it sends. It was a bluff. There was no lawyer. There was no scheduled email. I was standing in an alley with a box cutter and a rusted truck, but Hayes didn't know that. He only knew the woman standing in front of him was unrecognizable from the wife he had left in his living room. He stared at me, his jaw working furiously. The muscles in his neck were taut like bowstrings. He was weighing his options, running the tactical equations in his head. His career, his pension, the unmitigated disaster of a public scandal. Slowly, defeatedly, Hayes bent down and picked up the damp manila envelope. He didn't look at me as he brushed the snow off the paper. He looked at the brick wall behind my head. "You are going to regret this, Nora," he said, his voice dropping into a venomous hiss. "When the reality of living in squalor hits you, when you have nothing." "I already have nothing, Hayes," I said, stepping past him, moving toward the stairs to my apartment. I stopped at the heavy metal door and looked back over my shoulder. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned. I didn't wait for his response. I pulled the door open, stepped inside, and locked the deadbolt behind me. I ran up the stairs, my chest heaving. I didn't pack nicely. I threw my remaining clothes into the duffel bags. I grabbed the coffee can full of cash. I grabbed my toothbrush. I was out of the apartment in under 10 minutes. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I peered through the small, frosted window of the door. The alley was empty. The dark SUV was gone. I walked the 3 blocks to my truck. The cold didn't bother me anymore. My skin felt flushed, electric. I threw the bags into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, drowning out the silence of the night. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove toward the interstate, the yellow lines blurring into a continuous ribbon of freedom. The dashboard clock read 11:42 p.m. I was heading east, toward the mountains, toward a horizon that belonged entirely to me. I didn't know where I was going to sleep tomorrow. I didn't know what I was going to do for work. But as I rolled the window down an inch, letting the freezing, pine-scented air whip across my face, I took a deep, shuddering breath. No bleach, no hospital monitors, no suffocating cologne, just the sharp, clean scent of the open road. I was alive, and for the first time in 10 years, I was sensible enough to save myself. That's how I burned down the life that was killing me and built something entirely my own from the ashes. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but it was mine. If Nora's journey resonated with you, or if you've ever had to walk away from a situation that demanded too much of your soul, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that leaving isn't failing, it's surviving. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join our community for more intense, grounded stories. Let me know in the comments, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to walk away from?